He had nearly 500,000 people watching his every move, over 700 videos, 6 years of consistent, respected, audience-loved content. And then he walked away, not because anything went wrong, but because he decided it was time. His name is Pete Larson. He's the farmer, former architect, and creator behind Just a Few Acres Farm, one of the most quietly beloved small farm YouTube channels in the country. And what he did in May 2026 is something most creators in his position would never have the nerve to do. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Pete made the decision he did, and why the most surprising part isn't that he quit YouTube. It's that he's done this before. The farm had been there the whole time. Not a metaphor, not a story beat. Literally, Pete Larson's family has farmed the same 45 acres in Lansing, New York since 1804. That land was deeded as a Revolutionary War plot. Pete is the 7th generation to live on it. 7 generations. That's not heritage. That's something you carry in your chest, whether you want to or not. Pete grew up on that land with his grandfather, helped with the cattle, knew the property the way you only know a place when you've spent your childhood in it. Every slope of the pasture, every creek in the old farmhouse floor, every corner of the barn. And then, like most teenagers with ambition and restlessness and something to prove, he left. He went to Syracuse University, got a degree in architecture, moved to the city, met Hilary. They married. They built a life in Syracuse that looked, by any external measure, like success. Pete climbed inside his firm, a practice focused on educational design, colleges and grade schools. And by the time he was 31, he was a part owner, principal partner, a title that means you've made it. He was also quietly miserable, not in a crisis way, not in a dramatic it-all-fell-apart way, more in the slow, accumulating way that a person realizes, over years, that they have built a life that fits perfectly on paper and fits them not at all. Pete himself described it later as a growing anxiety, something he spent 5 years pondering before he did anything about it. And that's the part of Pete Larson's story that most people skip right over when they talk about him. They see the farm and they see the YouTube channel, and they assume the transformation was sudden. It wasn't. It was slow and deliberate and deeply, genuinely thought through, which is exactly why, when he finally acted, the decision was total. What happened next set the template for everything that would follow, including what he did in 2026. Anxiety is a quiet teacher, and Pete Larson let it teach him for a long time. By his own account, he had a job that gave him unusual freedom. He could choose his projects, set his own hours, run his days the way he wanted. From the outside, it looked like the dream version of a professional career. From the inside, something had already shifted. He spent years trying to figure out what that shift meant before he understood it clearly. He needed to go back to Lansing. First, he asked for a leave of absence. That's the move of a man who isn't fully certain yet, who needs to test the water before he steps in. He took 6 months away from the firm and started raising broilers on the family land. Chickens, specifically, on the 45 acres he'd grown up on. By the time those 6 months were over, Pete had his answer. He sold his stake in the architectural firm. He was 44 years old. His wife, Hilary, who had built her own career as a nurse, made the same leap. They moved into the old Larson farmhouse on Van Ostrand Road, a structure that his great-great-grandfather had started building in 1860 and finished a decade later. It hadn't had modern amenities in years. It was, by most accounts, in serious disrepair. They parked a trailer on the property and renovated the farmhouse themselves, Pete drawing on his architectural knowledge while learning construction as he went. They built the farm with a philosophy that set them apart from almost every other agricultural operation in their region. No debt, no mortgage, no equipment loans, no credit cards. They used savings to fund early expenses and reinvested earnings back into the farm account. Every purchase came out of what the farm had actually generated. Pete's great-grandmother had farmed this same land with frugality and low overhead, and he and Hilary modeled their approach on hers. They raised Dexter cattle, a heritage Irish breed, compact and grass-fed, alongside chickens, turkeys, and hogs. They powered the property with solar electricity. They heated with firewood cut from their own land. They sold directly to consumers through a CSA program and local farmers markets. They did almost everything themselves. In 2014, Pete published a book about the experience, A Year and a Day on Just a Few Acres, which chronicled not just the farming, but the psychology of walking away from an apparently successful career to do something that scared him. Readers who found it described it as one of the most honest accounts of voluntary reinvention they'd ever read. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. The book was the first way Pete tried to share what he'd learned. YouTube was the second. He didn't launch the channel until 2019, 5 years after the book, 6 years after leaving architecture, nearly a decade after moving back to the farm full-time. That delay matters. A lot of people who make a dramatic life change immediately want to document it, monetize it, turn the experience into content. Pete waited until he actually knew what he was doing before he started teaching it. He said it himself. His experience in architecture had given him two specific skills that transferred directly to YouTube. Public speaking, he'd done it throughout his professional career, and understanding how to keep a business healthy and a customer satisfied. He saw the channel as an extension of those skills, another way to connect with people, another way to share knowledge. What he built was not a standard farming vlog. That's worth saying clearly, because farming content on YouTube spans everything from scripted drama to scenic lifestyle footage to equipment brand promotional vehicles dressed up as independent channels. Just a few acres farm was something different. Pete talked about grazing rotation and pasture management with the same calm precision he'd once brought to architectural specifications. He explained the business logic of small-scale farming, why debt-free operations survive when financed ones fail, why heritage breeds can carve out a market niche that commodity livestock can't reach, why selling directly to your community builds something more resilient than a supply chain. He was a thinking person making content for thinking people. The channel grew steadily, not viral, not explosive, steady. By the time it peaked, it had pulled in approximately 469,000 subscribers. For reference, that's nearly 500,000 people who chose, repeatedly, to watch a man discuss rotational grazing, poultry processing, and the philosophy of meaningful work. In an era of reaction videos and challenge content, that audience said something. Viewers described watching Pete the way people describe a good teacher, someone who made you feel like the subject mattered, and like you were capable of understanding it. Many of them had never set foot on a farm and had no intention of starting one. They watched anyway. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me because this next part is why the whole story matters. Nearly 700 videos over 6 years is a volume of work most creators don't hit in a decade. That number deserves some weight. 200 uploads a year, on average, consistently produced, edited, and published, while simultaneously running a working livestock farm that required daily animal care, rotational grazing management, seasonal processing, direct consumer sales, and the ongoing maintenance of a 150-year-old farmhouse. Pete and Hilary had no full-time employees. Pete's father, who lived next door, helped when needed. That was the operation. One of the consistent things that viewers noticed, and that Pete talked about openly, was the farm's financial structure. The Larsons were debt-free by design. They'd started that way and stayed that way. For a small farming operation competing in a market dominated by industrial agriculture and commodity pricing, that discipline was the difference between a farm that survived and one that didn't. Pete was also deeply embedded in the local agricultural community. He served on Tompkins County's Agricultural Advisory Committee. He was part of the town of Lansing's Agriculture and Farmland Protection Plan Committee, working on zoning that would classify and protect farmland from the suburban development creeping up Van Ostrom Road toward his property. He wasn't just farming, he was advocating for the conditions that made farming possible in his region. The channel reflected that broader engagement. Pete didn't make content from a bubble. He talked about the pressures facing small farms, the economic reality of competing against much larger operations, the tension between the newer farmers market culture and the older agricultural traditions in Tompkins County. He positioned just a few acres somewhere between those two worlds, and that in-between position is part of what made the channel interesting to people who had nothing to do with farming at all. Hilary was central to the operation in ways that went beyond visible screen time. A trained nurse, she had retooled herself entirely to farm work, learning to drive tractors, managing animal care alongside Pete, and handling the consumer-facing side of their CSA program. She and Pete divided responsibilities not by gender or convention, but by skill and capacity. Here's what the comments kept asking. And here's the answer they never got, until now. As early as March 2026, viewers had started noticing something. Uploads had slowed. The rhythm had shifted. For a channel that had maintained such a consistent output for years, the change was perceptible to the audience even before Pete addressed it directly. Tribute channels and commentary creators began speculating. Search traffic around Pete's name spiked with questions about what was happening. That pattern, the audience noticing a slowdown before the creator says anything, is one of the most common leading indicators on YouTube when a long-term creator is working toward an exit. Pete hadn't announced anything, but the channel's output told the story before the final video did. What the audience likely didn't know was what Pete has consistently described as the internal process behind his biggest decisions, years of quiet reckoning before any public action. He spent 5 years processing his dissatisfaction with architecture before he took his leave of absence. He waited 6 more months of that leave before fully committing to the farm. He spent 5 years farming before he launched the channel. This is a man who does not move until he's certain, and who, once certain, moves completely. The book he published in 2014 is essential context here. A Year and a Day on Just a Few Acres is not primarily a farming book. It's a book about the psychology of voluntary reinvention, about what it feels like to walk away from a career the world respects in order to pursue something the world questions. Pete had already written out his philosophy of transformation before he ever turned a camera on. The YouTube exit wasn't a departure from that philosophy. It was an expression of it. He'd also said, in that Grit interview, something that foreshadowed May 2026 more precisely than anyone realized at the time. I had a great job that gave me a lot of leeway, but I wasn't happy. He wasn't talking about YouTube. He was talking about architecture. But the phrasing fits both transitions with unsettling accuracy. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around him saw coming. In May 2026, Pete Larson posted his last video to Just a Few Acres Farm. He didn't preface it with months of announcement. He didn't do a farewell tour of greatest hits. He made a video the way he'd made 700 others, plainly, directly, without theatrical staging. He and Hilary, both in their 50s, had decided to end the channel. What they were going to do instead, they didn't say. More than that, they couldn't say. Not because they were hiding it, because they genuinely didn't know. It occurred to both of us that we didn't need to know, Pete said. That sentence, for anyone who has followed Pete over the years, is deeply characteristic. This is a man who has made his biggest moves not towards something specific, but away from something that no longer fit. He didn't leave architecture to become a farmer. He left architecture because he was no longer an architect in the way that mattered. He didn't start YouTube to build a media brand. He started it because he had something worth sharing, and a skill set that let him share it. And when that equation changed, he didn't pretend it hadn't. Near the end of the final video, Pete said 2 words, "I'm sorry." Not for anything he'd done wrong, for the rhythm that people had built their days around. He understood that for many of his viewers, Just a Few Acres Farm wasn't entertainment. It was a place they went, a steadying presence in a week that often offered very little steadiness. He felt the weight of leaving that. He said so. The response from the broader farming YouTube community was immediate. Other creators made tribute videos. Longtime viewers left comments that ran into paragraphs about what the channel had meant to them. People who'd never farmed described how watching Pete farm had changed the way they thought about work and time and purpose. A technologist in San Francisco wrote about it publicly, saying Pete had paid attention to what was right rather than what was convenient. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. What makes Peter Larson's story genuinely rare isn't that he left architecture. Lots of people walk away from careers that aren't working. It isn't that he built a successful farm. Small farms that succeed against the odds exist, not in large numbers, but they exist. It isn't even that he built a YouTube channel with nearly 500,000 subscribers while simultaneously running a debt-free livestock operation. Impressive, but there are other creators who've crossed that threshold. What's genuinely rare is that Pete Larson has now made the same essential decision twice. At 44, he chose to walk away from a career the professional world respected, towards something the professional world questioned. At 50-something, he chose to walk away from a platform the internet world respected, towards something undefined. Both times, the external circumstances were good. The channel wasn't failing. His audience wasn't shrinking. There was no crisis forcing his hand. He simply recognized, with the same slow internal process he'd used before, that he had moved through one chapter and the next one was somewhere else. That's not a pattern the internet knows how to talk about. The internet tells stories about burnout, scandal, comeback, and rebrand. It doesn't have a great vocabulary for a person who leaves because they're done, fully, cleanly done, and trusts themselves to find the next thing without announcing it in advance. Pete also wrote about this in his book, The Psychology of Change and the Deep Discomfort of Not Knowing What Comes After. He lived it once at 44. He walked back into that same unknown in his 50s. The farm wasn't leaving. The land wasn't going anywhere. Just a Few Acres, the physical place, continues as it has since 1804. What ended was the documentation of it. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. And according to Pete, the conversation was between him and Hilary, and it was quiet, and when it was over, they both already knew. The 700 videos are still there. That's the first thing to understand about what comes after Pete's farewell. The Just a Few Acres Farm channel remains up. The archive exists. The content continues generating views. The farm continues generating its CSA customers and farmers market sales. And the family continues on the land that the Larsons have worked since the early 19th century. Nothing ended except the uploads. But something did end, and it's worth naming precisely. What ended is the real-time window into a particular kind of life. Viewers who found the channel had found, in it, proof that a specific set of choices were possible. Leave the career that doesn't fit. Operate without debt. Grow food on a scale that matches your values, not your loan obligations. Let the land teach you things. Do the work publicly enough that it helps other people think through their own version of the same questions. Pete himself is, in his 50s, doing what he's always done in the gaps between chapters, not announcing, not performing uncertainty for an audience, but living in the actual uncertainty until its shape becomes clear. The farm is there. Hilary is there. The seventh generation connection to 45 acres in upstate New York is there. What isn't there anymore is the camera pointed at it. For the audience, that distinction matters more than it might seem. 500,000 people subscribe to a channel run by a man who left a good job to grow food and then, when the time came, left that too. Without bitterness, without drama, and with enough clarity to say I'm sorry and mean it for exactly the right reasons. That takes more than courage. It takes a sustained, practiced relationship with your own judgment. Pete Larson has been building that relationship since before most of his subscribers had ever heard of him. Pete Larson didn't become a farmer to become a YouTuber. He became a farmer because farming was true. He started the channel because sharing was useful, and he ended it because ending it was honest. What comes next for Pete and Hilary is, by their own design, unknown. The farm will keep turning. The Dexter cattle will keep grazing. The land that has been in the Larson family since 1804 will keep producing food for their community in Lansing. Whether Pete ever picks up a camera again, for another channel, a new project, something none of us have imagined yet, is a question he has deliberately left open. What he leaves behind is 700 videos of a man showing his work, not just the farming work, the work of figuring out what matters, and then building your life around it, and then being willing to do it again. Do you think Pete Larson made the right call, walking away from nearly 500,000 subscribers when there was nothing wrong? Or is that the kind of decision only someone who's already done it once could actually make? Let me know below.